Hello and welcome to Developing RESTful Web Services using Spring Boot. My name is Vinod and I have over 24 years of teaching experience in IT industry. In this course, I will show you how easy it is to develop practical, production-ready RESTful microservices using Spring Boot step by step. Spring Boot is the Spring's convention over configuration solution for creating standalone, production-grade, Spring-based applications that you can just run. It is pre-configured with the Spring team's opinionated view of the best configuration and use of Spring platform and third-party libraries such as Apache Tomcat, so you can get started with minimal fuss. Most Spring Boot applications need very little or no Spring configuration at all. Even if you do not have any prior knowledge of Spring, I assure you that you will be able to understand and use Spring Boot for your projects. All I expect from you is fundamental knowledge of Java programming language. Before you start coding along with me, make sure that you have Java 1.8 or later version installed and you have downloaded the Eclipse IDE for Enterprise Java developers. So let's get started. The first thing that we will do is to visit start.spring.io webpage, which takes us to Spring Initializer application. Here we can configure our project, such as do we want to use Maven project or a Gradle project. I would like to use Maven project. You can code Spring Boot using Java, Kotlin or Groovy. I would choose Java. And the Spring Boot version itself, which is 2.1.7. And you can give here your project details, such as what is the group ID, artifact ID. Let me give it as co.vinod and Spring Boot demo. There are a few options that you can explore, such as what is the description, what's the package name going to be, is it a jar project or a var. Most of the time we would be using Spring Boot for creating microservices or web APIs, so it's going to be just a jar file, standalone project. The version of Java, I would leave it to the default, which is 8 at this time. And then you can add some dependencies by either typing here if you know what you're looking for, such as web, security, JPA, actuator, DevTools, etc. as indicated over here. Or you can click on the list here and choose some of them. For this project, I will only add one single dependency, and as and when we need, we will add more. So I'm going to just type web and select the Spring Web Starter, add this to our list. Now you can download the entire zip file consisting of the Maven project, or I can explore individual files and choose whatever that I want. So I choose to go with this explore the project option. That will show me the pom.xml and any other related files. I simply have to click the copy button that copies the content of pom.xml to our clipboard, and then I'll go to Eclipse. I have already opened Eclipse in a brand new workspace. As you can see, there is nothing over here. I will simply create a new Maven project. Click on this check mark that says create a simple project. Next, I'll give the group ID as co.vinod, artifact ID as Spring Boot-demo. I'll leave the version as 0.0.1 snapshot and packaging as jar. Click finish to come out of this. Here is the project that got created, which doesn't have anything except a pom.xml. I open the pom.xml, replace that with the one that we copied from Spring Initializer. As soon as I save it, Eclipse will start downloading all the jars from the dependency list. This may take a while in case if you're doing this for the first time. In my case, it has already done because I have worked on this kind of examples earlier. So all the Maven dependencies have come to my project right now. But you may see that there are a couple of errors over here that says Maven configuration problem. Number one, it says unknown, so we can ignore this. The second one says project configuration is not up to date with pom.xml, and select Maven update project from the project context menu or use quick fix. All we have to do is to right click the project, go to Maven, update project. I'll say OK, and the errors are gone. Let's close this. Create a new Java class that acts as a starting point for our application. So I'm going to right click on this src main Java, new class. I'll give the package as core.vinod, and the name of the class happens to be application. You can give any name you want. I just wanted to give application. The application is simply going to have one main function, and I'm going to say here spring application dot run, and then I supply the application dot class itself. One last thing I have to do is to say that this is a Spring Boot project by adding an annotation @ Spring Boot application. Save this, and now I can run the code. When I run this program, Spring will run an internal Tomcat server and blocks the port 8080. In my case, however, 8080 has been used by Jenkins. As you can see here, it has been used by Jenkins. So I have two options: either stop Jenkins at 8080 and allow this Spring application to run on 8080, or I can ask Spring to use a different port number. Now this can be done by adding a properties file to our resources section. So I'm going to add here a file by going to new other general file, and let's name this as application.properties. Now these properties can be configured either using application.properties or application.yml or application.yaml file. For this demo, I will stick with application.properties. And all I have to do is to say server.port equals to a port of my choice. Let's give it as 7777. I save this, close this application.properties, right click on this file, run as Java application. As soon as I do that, on the console you can see that it comes up with lots of logs. That includes logs from Tomcat saying that Tomcat started at port number 777, started application in 5.903 seconds. And as you can see that the application is still running, it has not quit, it's not terminated. I can forcefully terminate that over here. But if I want, I can go to a browser and access this localhost :7777 and then press enter, and we get some white label error. But of course, this is an output coming from our project. Now let's add some greeting message over here instead of this error page. So let's go back to our code and write a function here called public string say hello, which returns a hello world message. But if I want this particular function to respond to this browser request, we have to add two annotations here. Number one, we have to say that this is the RESTful controller by typing @REST controller. And then we have to add a mapping to this particular function saying that whenever the user makes a GET request for localhost 777, we want to actually respond from here. So that can be done by typing @get mapping. Save this. Now note that the previously run program has to be stopped if I want to run this again. So I have stopped it. I right click on this program, run as Java application. A similar output comes just like the previous one. And now I can come back to the browser and refresh the same, and we should see here hello world message came up. Now if I want to change the message, I can change this, but then again I have to click the stop button and then run the program again. Now since we want to develop web services quickly, this can be a hurdle. So what we can do now is I can stop this for a minute and then add a dependency from Spring Initializer called as DevTools. So all I have to do is to add the DevTools as dependencies, get the new pom.xml, and then replace the current pom.xml with the new content. Save it, and you will see that Eclipse is downloading the newer version and it's updated. Now I can actually run this project once. And then change the content whenever I want. And every time there is something changed and the file has been saved, the file gets compiled and automatically DevTools will reload this once again. For example, instead of hello world, I can say hello Spring Boot. Save it. And you can see that there is a reloading of the server. I go back to the browser, refresh this once again, and you will see that it says hello Spring Boot again. Now let's add a more useful REST controller here. Instead of doing everything in this application itself, let's create a new class that acts as a customer REST controller. And this controller should have mappings for get, post, put, delete requests. So first of all, let's create a new class here called as customer REST controller. We can also add a sub package over here saying that this is something to do with controllers. Say finish. And notice that every time I add or modify some files, Spring Boot project is going to restart. So that can be sometimes annoying. I'm going to stop that. And here I'm going to say that this is a REST controller, as well as this is going to handle all the requests for a prefix called API customers. So you can do that by typing @request mapping /API/customers, which means that I can come over here localhost 7777 /API/customers, and then when I send the request, this request will now be handled by one of the function within this particular class. And let's say we want to have a function here which gives me some response. So I'm going to write a function here called public. I can say string. Let's call it as get all customers. Return all customers data will come from here. The only thing that I have to do here is to say @get mapping. Now @get mapping is equivalent to a request mapping with a method of get. So I can as well say here request mapping method equals to request method dot get. So this was the only way you could have done in the past, but now we have a simpler way of doing by saying get mapping. So let's save this, run the program and see if we can get this going. So I'm going to go here, right click, run as Java application. And then I can come down here and then say API/customers. I press enter and it says all customers data will come here. But what we want is not a string, but a JSON representation of customer data. And we don't have any class representing customers. So let's begin by creating a class called customer representing customer data. For this, I'm going to go and create a new class called customer. I right click on this co.vinod.controllers, new class. But this class being an entity class, I can name the package as co.vinod.entity or model or domain, and then give the name as customer. Let's assume that we do have a integer ID for a customer, couple of other details such as customer name, an email, probably a phone number, let's say city, state, and probably country. We also want to know whether the customer is male or female, so I can say private string gender. And I think this should be good enough for our customer class. Since all these are private variables, you can only make use of them by exposing via getters and setters. Now traditionally we would have done that by going to source, generate getters and setters, and then you can add a toString constructor using fields, constructor using superclass, etc., etc. But we do have a better mechanism called Lombok. Now to work with Lombok, let's go to our Spring initializer, add Lombok as a dependency, get the newer version of POM, copy that, and go back to our project, replace the current pom.xml with that one. And in a minute, that project is ready. Now, in my case, Lombok has been already set up. So if I go to customer.java and add here @noargs constructor, you will see that there is a constructor in the outline, as well as I can say @getter, @setter, and you can see that getters and setters are added automatically. Now in your case, if you're using Lombok for the first time, this may not happen. So first thing you do is to go to Maven dependencies, expand this, find out where is the Lombok jar. In my case right here, right click and say copy qualified name. And this will give me the name and location of the jar. You can also see it, the status bar here. It's under my users Vinod Kumar .m2 repository org project Lombok, etc. So you can find that right here. Now on Windows, you have to go to that location and double click the lombok.jar. On Mac or Linux, open a terminal and then just type java -jar followed by the jar file name, which I just copied from Eclipse. And then when I press enter, it is going to come up with a user interface. And this user interface will search for all the IDEs that are there. Like this, in my case, it is under /applications eclipse.app. If you don't see your Eclipse location over here, you can click on the specify location, find out the eclipse.ini file, and then you should be able to install or update. In my case, it's already updated. You can see that the symbol here. But if you want, you can always say install update and then quit the installer. Once you have installed, you have to close Eclipse and open. Now, do not do file restart. That doesn't help. You have to physically close Eclipse and then open again. And then you should be able to see your respective getters, setters, or any other additional annotations that you have used. Now that I have here a customer class, let's go to our customer REST controller and say that we would like to return a list of customers over here. And to do so, I can say list of customer, import list from java.util by pressing Ctrl+Shift+O on Windows or Command+Shift+O on Mac, and make sure that you select from java.util.list. And now we need to return a list of customers over here. Let's say I want to create 2 customers and then return them as a list. So let's say customer C1 equals to new customer, C1 dot set ID of 1. Let's say set name of, let's say I give my name, C1 dot set email, C1 dot set phone, and then C1 dot set city, Bangalore, C1 dot set gender. I can also create a second customer. Let's call it as C2 equals to new customer, and then I'll say C2 dot set ID of 2, C2 dot set name of, let's say Shyam, set email, and I think C2 dot set city should do the job. Now in order to return these 2 customers as a list, I'm going to simply say return arrays.asList of C1, C2. Now that this function is ready, let's go and rerun the application.java which starts our Tomcat server. And then I can go back to the browser and access the same thing. And you'll see now I got a JSON version of the object. Now that we got data which is hard-coded, let's get the data from database. For this, we need two things. Number one, we need an RDBMS server. And number two, we need data file. So first let's go to a website called markaru.com, which gives me mock data. So here I can choose what are the fields I want, what kind of data that I want for those fields, and I can choose between CSV, JSON, SQL, etc. How many rows you want, up to 1,000 you can get it for free of cost. You can also choose what kind of line ending and so on and so forth. So in our customer.java, we have ID as a number. So this is going to be okay, row number. I don't have a first name, last name, but I have just name. So I can delete one of them and then call this as name. But the kind of data, I don't want only last name. I want the full name. So I can look for full name. And that's going to be full name. I want email, gender. I don't want an IP address, but I want a phone number. So I select the data type to be a phone, and that's going to be a phone number. You can also say what format of the phone number. I just want 10-digit phone number, nothing else. I can also rearrange them, add another field, which is city. Let's add a city. One more, state, and one last for country. And then I can say here how many rows I want. 1,000 is okay with me. I want SQL format. What is the name of the table? I'm going to call this as customers. Include create table also. And I can click on download data. And I'll download the same thing into my workspace location, which is under desktop, and my course folder under workspace. I'm going to save it as customers.mssql. Now that the file is ready, let's go and open the same thing in a text editor, which is here, customers.mssql. Open with, I'm going to open that with text edit. And this is how it looks like. Create table customers, int ID. Notice that there is no primary key. We can add them. And I'll say here, primary key, auto underscore increment. Name is supposed to be not null. Email, let's make it as unique. Same thing with phone is going to be unique. And the rest of them are okay with me. I'll save this and close the file. Now that we got the data, let's use an RDBMS called H2 database. So you can go to h2database.com and then look for its download options. The current version is 1.4.199, which somehow seem to have some issues. So let's not download this one, but let's go to all downloads. And then you can see it says the last stable version happens to be 1.4.197. Now, if you're on Windows, you can download the Windows installer, which simply installs a folder on your computer. Alternately, you can download platform independent zip file, which I have already downloaded and unzipped in my home directory. So if you happen to see here, under my home directory, I have a folder here called H2, and that H2 has a bin directory, h2-1.4.197.jar. There's a .sh file that you can use in Mac or Linux. You also have h2.bat for Windows. Now on Windows, you can simply double click this file and you should see that the server will be started, as well as a client application will open in a browser. On Mac or Linux, you can just copy the path of the file by going to services, copy path, and then open a terminal and then paste this, press enter. You can see that the server started, and on the menu bar you can see there is an icon. On Windows, you will see the similar icon on a notification area at the bottom right. The browser that came up is basically a client application that allows us to connect to this particular server. In case if you happen to close this, you can always get this back from this icon, then click on H2 console. Now, if you are running this for the first time, you may see something called generic H2 embedded, and the options would be a little bit different over here. So make sure that you selected generic H2 server. Here you can give some custom name and click on the save button, and this name will appear in the drop down. The driver class happens to be r.h2.driver. No change over there. The JDBC URL has the server and client protocol, the server location, and then you have a name of the DB which is called test by default. I can change this to a new DB called Spring Boot -training, and then click the test connection to see if everything is okay. You may notice that the username SA and password, a blank password, is default. If you want, you can change that and then click the connect button, and then you will be taken into the database. Now here you can type in commands such as create, alter, drop, select, etc. But since we already have got the data in an SQL file, we have to type the command run script from, in single quotes, give the path to that particular file. In my case, I downloaded that and kept in my workspace directory. So I'll go to the workspace location, and this is the file. Once again, I will copy the path of the file, and then come back over here, paste that, quotes complete. If I click on the run button here now, it's going to execute the command, and if there is no problem, it will give you some kind of update count. You can click the clear button and then look at the customers here. I have all the fields. Clicking on the customers will bring me a select star from customers. Click the run button and I should be able to see all the customers that I have added through Makaro.com. Now that we have customers data, let's map our customer class that we wrote earlier to this particular table. Now for this, we need few more dependencies. First, let me stop the server if it is running, because every time I make some changes, the server keeps restarting and sometimes it becomes annoying. So let's go back to start.spring.io, close this pom.xml, and we want to add this time JPA. Spring Data JPA provides a persistence mechanism to our application. So let's click on that, get the new version of the pom.xml, copy that to the clipboard. Let's go here, replace our current pom.xml with the new one. And as soon as I do that, newer dependencies have been added to my project. And the first thing that I want to do is to specify information about the DB. And that I can do by going to the application.properties, add a couple of JPA related information. Number one is what is the driver class that we want to use. So this is done by giving spring.datasource.driver class name equals to r.h2.driver is the value for the same. Next, spring.datasource.url. You may get the value for this URL from our H2 client. Let's first disconnect and then copy this one and then paste over here. Similarly, I also want to give username equals to SA, password equals to blank, so do not give any additional space. But along with this, you also have to give one more thing, which is spring.jpa.hibernate.ddl-auto none. Now, if you are familiar with Hibernate, you know that there is something called HBM to DDL auto, where Hibernate automatically creates the tables corresponding to the customer.java that I have written. To say that we already have table and the data corresponding to the customer.java, we say that Hibernate should not manufacture the new table in the backend. Otherwise, your data along with the table will be deleted and newly constructed. So let's save this and go back to customer.java. Now in the customer.java, we have to say that this particular class corresponds to the customer's table. There are two annotations for doing this. Number one is @entity, and this comes from Java x.persistence package. This is required because JPA, which is Java Persistence API, will only consider classes that are marked with @entity. Now, since the table name is different than the class name, we may have to specify that exclusively by typing @table name equals to customers. Once again, import the same thing from Java x.persistence package. Though this is not case sensitive, it is a good practice to follow either lowercase or uppercase for the table names. One other thing that you may want to mention here, that the ID is the primary key among the others. So I can say here @ID, as well as if you want to say that this is automatically generated by a backend, we'll say @generated value strategy equals to identity. This is applicable for any column in the backend where auto_increment has been given. Now, in case if you have not given auto_increment but still want Hibernate to automatically increment this, then you can say generator equals to increment. In this case, Hibernate will automatically increment the value from the application rather than from the server. So since in our case we are given ID as auto_increment, I can roll back to strategy equals to generation type dot identity. The other values for this could be something like sequence. Sequence is applicable for Oracle, or you can also specify that it is table. So where a specific table would be created representing only primary key values, or you can let it go automatically by choosing auto here. Now in my case, I'm going to specify identity. If any of the columns are of different names than their respective field names, you may also want to annotate that by @column. So in my case, all of them have the exact same name as the backend table columns, so I don't have to do that. Now that we have done the mapping of customer class to customers table in the RDBMS, let's now create an interface that can give us all the values from the table. Now this is where Spring's magic comes into picture. All we have to do is to create an interface that extends something called CRUD repository, and automatically Spring is going to create a class at the runtime on the fly and gives an object of the same. Let's understand this by a practical example. Now in our controller, we needed to return the list of all customers. So for that, we have to get the data from the database. While we have done the mapping over here, the question is, how do I get the data from the database? Now, traditionally, you might have used JDBC to write select statements, get the data from the database, and so on and so forth. Or if you have used Hibernate or JPA, then you may want to use the session or entity manager to get the data and work with that. But in all cases, you have to write the code. But in this case, let's say we don't have to write any code and still get the data from the database. Let's understand this by creating an interface called customer repository. And let's change the package from controllers to DAO or repository as you feel. And then importantly, we have to extend this with CRUD repository. So let's say OK and then come out of this. Now you can see here that there is an error because this is an incomplete code. So we say that this is a customer repository extending CRUD repository. Now CRUD is an acronym for create, read, update, delete. So this particular interface has already functions related to inserting the data, retrieving the data, updating or deleting the corresponding data. So we have to specify what kind of entity object that it works with. So T here is the type. So I'm going to say customer, and then ID is the data type of the primary key value of this. Now if you go back to customer, you can see that the ID annotation has been added to integer. So this is the data type of our ID. So I go back to my repository and I say that the data type is integer. And that's all I have to do. So if you click on this CRUD repository and press function key 4, you will see that there are a bunch of functions over here. For example, count gives me the number of customer objects that are available in the database. Delete, deleting an object. Delete all, of course, all of the records would be deleted. There is also find all, exist by ID, delete by ID, save, which is meant for inserting as well as updating, depending on whether the primary key is null or there is a value. So all these functions are already available in our interface. One last thing I have to do here is to mark this with @repository. This way, Spring knows that whenever we want an object of this class, it will create a class and then instantiate and give that same thing to us. Now, how can I use this one now? Now, this is where we go back to our customer REST controller and we say that, hey, we need an object of customer repository. So let's call it as repo. We'll also make them as private. Now, notice that this is a member variable of this class. So by default, it is null. So we want to use this repo and then return an object. So we're going to remove this C1 and C2 and obviously arrays.asList. I'll simply have to say repo.findAll. Now you can see that the findAll is an iterable and iterable is a super type for list. So we can't really do a return. Now there are two ways to handle this scenario. Number one, I can do a casting or I can change this from list to iterable. Now there is no problem, I can work with this. But there is only one issue here. Since this is a member variable, the default value for this is null. Obviously, null.findAll is going to be a null pointer exception. This is where we have to tell Spring that, hey, when this function is being called, we are actually needing an object of repository, which is a customer repository. And the customer repository is an interface. So we want an object of that data type. And all I have to do is to tell Spring that, hey, I need an object of customer repository. And how do we do this? You simply say @autowired. Now, when you say autowired, Spring knows that this is a subtype of CRUD repository. And Spring knows a way of creating a class because we have given what is the name of the class, like customer, what is the primary key value, and everything automatically is done. A class is created on the fly and an object is also created on the fly. That object is given to me here, so it is no longer null. And since it is not null, it's going to go and get the data from the database. So let's go and organize imports by pressing Ctrl+Shift+O on Windows, Command+Shift+O on Mac. So everything is intact. Let's run our application and see if we get the desired output. We got one error here that says cannot load driver class arg.h2.driver. That's because we said in our application.properties that the driver class happens to be this one and it's not there in any of the jars. Now we could handle this in two ways. Number one, you can go back to Spring Initializer and then specify that we want to look for h2 database and then get the pom.xml, etc., etc. But alternately, you can add the jar directly from the h2 jar that you downloaded earlier. So I go to Project, Properties, and then select Java Build Path, Libraries, Add External Jars. And then I go to my home directory where I have the h2 bin. And there we have h2-1.4.197.jar, open. And then say apply and close. Let's rerun the application.java once again and see if we got any more errors. Looks like everything is okay. Let's go back to our localhost 7777/API/customers. Let's refresh and we should see 1000 records over here. Now that we have a list of 1000 customers, quite often we don't want all the customers in the database because what if I have million records of customers? Now you don't want to send all million records at one shot, but you may want to send a chunk of them. For example, when you search anything in Google, Google may give you probably 20 or 50 records at the first page. And then if you want, you can go to the next page and so on and so forth. Somewhere I should be able to say that, hey, give me the page number 1, something like this, by typing question mark underscore page equals to 1. So this way I should get only the first page record, where the first page may consist of 10 records or 20 records, something that we can assume as default. So to do that, I can go back over here to Eclipse and then change our customer repository. Instead of extending CRUD repository, we can extend a subtype of CRUD repository called paging and sorting repository. So let's go add that here, paging and sorting repository. Save this. I have all the functions, but in addition, we also have a couple of extra features. So if I go back over here, so refresh here, I still see my 1000 records. Of course, now I have a way of processing this page number 1. Now, the underscore page is a convention that you say that the page number is 1. Similarly, if you want to say the size of the page is 20, for example, you may say ampersand underscore limit equals to 20. So these are not any keywords. It's your choice. If you want to change this from underscore page to say page size and P, L, etc., it's totally up to you. I'm going to stick with underscore page underscore limit for 2 parameters. Now, if I don't mention any one of them, it should be assumed. For example, if I don't mention any parameters at all, it should be assumed that I'm looking for page number 1. So to do this, let's go back to our code. In our REST controller, we're going to say here something like this. So we're going to add a couple of variables. Let's say integer page num, and then I'll say integer page size. If page num and page size have been supplied, I can supply those two information over here. Now, if you look at the find all parameters, there is a sort object that I can supply. There is an iterable IDs I can supply, and there is also pageable I can supply. So pageable is an interface that has a couple of options. So let's see how we can create that. So I'm going to say here pageable p equals to, which means information about the pageability such as page number and page size, is going to come from page request dot of, I can supply the page num and the size. So I'm going to say here page num and then let's say page size. And this pageable needs to be imported from Spring Framework. So let's do that. And then I can say find all of p. So we do have now a pageable option, but only one problem is that we did not tell Spring where to look for values for this page num and page size. Now, if you remember, we thought of using underscore page and underscore limit. So to do that, we may have to say here something like @request parameter, and the parameter name happens to be underscore page, and then I can say if it is not supplied, default value is 1, and that's what actually we have to say for page num. And then similarly, I can give here also an option saying that it is supposed to be underscore limit, and the default value happens to be 10. So in case if you don't supply the limit, we'll assume that it's going to be default. Now, one small thing here is that for us, the page number 1 means that we want to start from the record number 1, but the page request treats it as page number 2. So because the index of the page starts from 0, so we may want to specify here that page num -1, because we want to say when you want page number 1, we want to say here 0. So as soon as we're done with this, let's save it. Let's go back here and not specify any additional parameters and then refresh. I should see a smaller chunk here now, and you can see that it starts from page number 1. So hence ID number 1 to the last one, which would be ID number 10. But we also get a lot of additional information. But I'm only interested in the array of data. So if that is the case, you may have to say here find all dot get content, and that gives me a list of customers only. So when I go back here now, when I refresh that, you can see that we get a plain and simple array of data from 1 to 10. If you want the second page, you can always say question mark underscore page number equals to 2, and you can see we get it from 11 to 20 and so on and so forth. So if I say page number 33, we got 321 onwards up to 330, and that's how we are getting the results. Of course, we can also check that, hey, per page I want 20 records, not 10. So I can say ampersand underscore limit equals to 20 or 25, whatever that you feel right. And now you can see I got 20 records starting from 641. Before we go any further, let's use a tool called Postman. So go to Google and then look for Postman for Mac if you are on Mac, or you can say Windows if you are on Windows. And then it says here getpostman.com downloads. If you go to that, you should be able to see based on your operating system a download button is given. So since mine is Mac OS, I'm able to see that it's Mac OS application. Now what this does is it allows us to make requests based on the method like get, put, post, delete. For example, on the browser, when I typed here and pressed enter, it was always a get method and not post method. Also, at some point in time, if you want to send additional details like headers, you will not be able to send from the browser, but from Postman, you will be able to do this. Now, if you want, you can also look for other REST clients, but I use Postman. So let's go ahead and download and use that. So in my case though, I already have got Postman installed. Let me open the same and then make a request for our localhost 7777 API/customers. So let's add a new request. The request type is get. The URL happens to be http localhost://7777. If I send it, we are going to get the hello from Spring. I believe that's the response, hello Spring Boot. But if I say here /API/customers, I say send, and you can see that we got the customers from 1 to 10. So it also specifies that the status is 200, total time taken is 56 milliseconds, what's the size of it, and so on and so forth. Now, if you want to send some additional parameters, you can just put a question mark over here itself, or you can see there's a section here called params. Key happens to be, let's say, underscore page, and the value happens to be, let's say, 4. And you can see it is automatically updated over here. I say send, and I'm going to get from 31 to 40, which is the content of page number 4. Now that we have got a tool like Postman, let's add more functionalities. For example, instead of getting all the customers or of a particular page, what if I am looking for a customer by a ID? So for example, I can say customers/66, where I want to say that give me customer whose ID is 66 without mentioning the word ID. So we are not sending a query string parameter like question mark ID equals to 66, but we are saying here that /66. So we want to assume that this 66 here is a variable called ID. So let's go and add one additional function. This time I want to say public customer because I want to return a single customer. Let's call it as get customer by ID. We want an integer ID, and then I can simply say return repo.find by ID of ID. This says that the return type is not a customer but something called optional, and all I have to do is to say .get, and I get an actual customer object based on this ID. The question is, how do I map this? Because /API/customers cannot be mapped to two functions. We have to have some kind of difference. So we are going to say @get mapping, but this time it is for something with a parameter. So the curly bracket here is to say that this is a placeholder, and whatever is given over there is now recognized as ID. So it's going to be like slash API slash customers slash 66, and that 66 is now identifiable by using the word ID. And now we want to say that whatever is there in the ID should be given to this. Now previously you saw we said it's a request parameter. But this time it's not a request parameter, it's called as path variable. I have to simply add here @ path variable, and that should be good. Now in case if the value that you're given here ID is different than the name of the variable, then it won't happen. So all you have to do in that case is to say that this is ID. Since in my case the parameter ID here is same as the variable name, this part is optional, so let me get rid of that. So I'm going to save it, and now if I go back to Postman and then send this request, I should be able to get single customer data. So let me check it out by typing a different ID. Let's say for example 45, send it, and we do get a different object. Now what if I type here 4500 where I don't have the corresponding data? Now what happens is that you simply get an exception. So it says here 500 internal server error, and that's because there is a no value present, and this exception was actually created by a Spring and Hibernate combination. Now if you don't want this exception, and if you don't want this to be reported as internal server error because it's just that we don't have a value for this ID, it's still a proper response from the server, but I don't have a response content. If you want to do anything different, then what we can do here is to surround this with a try-catch block and then return a customer if it is found, but return a null value or a blank if there is no customer. So the first thing I'm going to do is to change the data type here to something called response entity of, I'll put a question mark. Question mark is being very generic. We say that we want to send some response, but we don't know what is the data type because it can be a customer, it can be a null value as well. So the number one thing that I'm going to do is to say get rid of this first, and then I'll say here try and catch an exception. So we're going to say here customer C1 equals to a report dot find by ID of ID dot get. So we got the customer, but if there is an exception, I'm going to go inside this, and then I want to return something else. First, let me return a valid response from here. So we're going to say response entity dot OK, and then we can say that hey, C1 is the body for this particular response because we have valid values. Now notice OK represents the status code 200, whereas if anything else is there, I can probably send some other response. For example, I can say 404 saying that it is not found instead of 500. So I can say here response entity, and I can say here dot status of, I can say 404, and then I can say dot body of null because I don't have any response to be sent. And then I can say here semicolon. Of course, I have to say return because I have to return some values. So both the places I have to say return. And now you see that when there is data, I'm going to say 200 and then I'm sending that customer object. But if the data is not found, I'm sending a 404 but a body of null. So let's go test it out. So first let's say 45. I have no problem in that. So we got the actual data 45. But if I say here 4567, which we don't have, and note that previous output is 200 status here, but when I send this now, we're going to get 404 and the body is null. So there's no error as internal server error. Now that we are able to get multiple records or a single record, let's see how we can do adding a new record. So to do that, let's go to our application, customer REST controller. Let's add a new function here, public response entity of question mark, add new customer. We receive a customer object, and then I'll say report dot save the customer. Now this actually adds the data that is coming from the parameter into the database automatically, because an assumption here is the customer ID is null and that customer object will be inserted into the database. The newly generated ID will be automatically set to this customer, And then I can simply say here return response entity dot OK with the customer object like this. And we have to add here at the rate post mapping to say that any request for /API/customers with the HTTP method called post should be handled by this particular function. Now the question is, how can Spring give me a customer object? How can, as a user, supply the customer object? Now if you come to Postman and choose a post method for /API/customers, you can see that there is an option here called body, and this is called request body or payload, and you can supply a form data with a name value pairs, similarly www form URL encoded. Then there is a raw, and then you can choose the type of text to be JSON or XML or plain text. So we are sending the actual customer data in JSON format, but that's a request body. So we have to tell Spring that, hey, the data coming from the request body should be converted into a customer object if possible. And then that customer object is now taken and added to the database. To do so, all I have to do is to write at the rate request body, and now Spring knows where to look for a customer details when a post request is made. Now let's give it a try by going back over here. We are sending a post request to localhost 7777/API/customers, and that's what actually this is mapped to API customers post mapping. But we have to send the body. I'm going to send a body here that contains name of the customer. Let's add my name. Let's say email vinod@vinod.co. Let's add a phone number, gender, city, Bangalore, state, Karnataka, and country is India. Now all I have to do is to send this. Note that I am not sending ID, but the response should be the same details with the newly generated ID. So let's click on the send button and see everything is okay. And as you can see that ID 1001 has been generated, and that's response is 200. All I have to do was to read the data from the request body and save into the database and then send the same customer back. So if I go back to the browser where my database I have access to here, so let's go connect, and then I can even check select star from customers where ID equals to 1001, click the run button. I should see the same data that I have sent from Postman. It has been added successfully as well. Now, as part of the CRUD operations, let's also provide update to our REST controller. Let's go to our controller here. I'm going to add a function here that returns response entity of customer. I'll say update customer. Now, as convention, we have to receive the ID of the customer for whom we want to make changes and the customer data itself. Now, it is possible that ID may be different than the customer's ID. We have to discard the customer's ID and then use this for updation. So the first thing I will be doing here is customer.setID of ID, and then I'll say here report.save customer. And if everything is okay, we just want to return this one. Now, what if something goes wrong? There will be an exception, and that exception will be returned as status code 500 with a custom error message from Spring Boot. Now, as far as the mapping is concerned, we have to say here @put mapping. We also have to say that this comes from a path variable. This comes from the request body. So we'll say here @path variable, whose name is going to be ID, and this is going to be from request body. And since we said that it's supposed to come from path variable, we also have to say here /curly bracket ID like this. So when you're making a request, you should say /API/customers/some ID and that ID will be mapped to this, plus the payload will be converted into a customer object and will be received over here. We are using the same function called save, but this time there is an ID, so because of which it's going to do an update if possible, and if there is any error, this will be reporting status code 500. Now first let's go and get one of the customer. Let's get the customer whose data is say 45. This is the data, and let's copy this and then make a put request. Let's go to the body, raw, and then I'll choose JSON and paste this. Now even if you give some different ID here, it doesn't matter because this is the ID that will be considered for update. Of course the rest of the data will be there. Let's change this from let's say phone number ending with 7588 to 0000. Some changes. Let's go and make the email to be example.com. Let's also make this as, let's say, Dallas and Texas. So now I can click on the send to see that the data has been updated. Let's go and check it out. What is the response? And you can see that the response came back after it has been updated. So let's go also to verify in the DB. Let's look for 45 and then say run. And you'll see that the phone number ends with 0000. City has been changed. State has been changed. The email is now @example.com. So everything has been updated. Let's do delete operation. First, you can see that I have the customer whose ID is 45. So I click the run button. I see the data. Let's go back, add a new function here, which is supposed to return the deleted customer data. So I'll say response entity of customer type. Let's call it as delete customer. We want to take the ID from the path variable. So I can actually copy this part and then paste over here. And then of course we have to search for this customer. If the customer is not found, we may want to respond with 404. So let's do that. We had done that earlier here, so we can say that we want to get this customer. So we're going to copy and paste the same thing. So we got the customer, but what if there is an error? So the customer doesn't exist. So I'll have to put that in a try catch block. So I'm going to put a try catch and paste over here. So if there is an exception, I'm going to say here that there is a 404. So I cannot delete this because the customer doesn't exist. So I can say that customer doesn't exist. But if the customer exists, I want to delete that first by doing a report.delete, and then I supply either delete by ID or delete the entity itself. So I can say C1, and then I'll say here return response entity dot OK, and then supply C1 because C1 happens to be the data that we deleted. So as far as the mapping is concerned, it is like put mapping, but there is no request body, but we just have to say @delete mapping, and then we say /ID because we have to say whose record we want to delete. So as soon as I save this, Spring Boot is restarting the application. Let's go back to the browser and check once again. So I'm going to say select start from customers where ID is 45. So we get the data. Let's go back to Postman. Now make the delete request this time, and delete request doesn't care about the body. There's no need of body, so I can remove that. So there's a delete 7777 API customers 45. So I click on send. Of course, it's going to delete, and I would get the data back. But if I try to send it again, you can see it's going to be a 404 because there is no data. So I click on send, and now you see it says 404 because this record is not there in the database anymore. Let's verify that by going to the database and click on the run button here, and you see that no rows found for ID 45. Now that we have done the RESTful web service, it's important to add API documentation to our service. Otherwise, when we share this to some customers who want to make use of our REST endpoints, now it is very difficult for them to read or understand our APIs, and many of the occasions we wouldn't be sharing the source code with them. So how do we do this? Now this is where you have a fantastic API called Swagger. So if you go to swagger.io, you can learn about how API development is simplified with the documentation of Swagger. Now, I don't want to go too deep into how this works, but I want to show you how to add Swagger to our application and get the API up and running. So the first thing we want to do is to get the Swagger. So if you go to Spring Initializer and look for Swagger here, you may not see that. Now, somehow Spring Boot does not have the default dependencies included over here. So we may have to explicitly go to mvnrepository.com and look for Swagger 2. Press enter. You can see it comes from io.springfox Swagger 2. So I'm going to select that. And the current version happens to be 292. So I just have to copy this. Go back to our pom.xml, add this as a dependency, so I can go to the end of the dependency list here and paste it, save this, and now I have one dependency that is added. With this dependency, we will be able to scan and get information about all the APIs we have. If you want a graphical user interface that displays all the APIs, provides some testing options, then you have to add one more dependency, which is from, let's go to Swagger UI, and if you see that it's again from io.springfox Swagger UI. The version also is the same thing, 292. I copy that once again, go back to my pom.xml, add as the last dependency, save it. It's going to download the jar files for the same. There are two more steps involved in enabling Swagger. Number one, we go to application.java and we say that we want to enable Swagger documentation. So I'm going to go here and then type @enable Swagger, and it says enable Swagger 2. And we have to add a bean definition here. So now what is this bean definition? Now when we say enable Swagger 2, it's going to look for an object that is going to scan your entire project for all the APIs and then build the documentation. Now this is called as a docket. And the way you do that is by typing public docket. So docket is supposed to come from SpringFox documentation, spring.web.plugins. And then we can call any name we want. Let's call it as API. And we have to return some docket object. So we say return new docket, and then we supply a what version. So you can see that it says what's the documentation type, that's the argument. So we say here documentation type dot Swagger 1 or Swagger 2. So we want to say Swagger 2. Now technically we should be able to return this object and everything should be okay, but this gives us configuration as well. Now we have to mark this as a bean so that Spring automatically instantiates this object, and then this docket object can be used for building the API documentation. Now to specify some configuration here, we say here dot select, and then this is what to say what APIs to be selected. We say select the APIs like dot APIs, and then say what are the APIs that we want to document, and we say any request handlers are there, such as the get mapping, post mapping, etc. So we want that. So we say request handler selectors dot any, saying that any type of handlers we want, and then we also say any type of paths that we want to specify, and again you can say path selector of any. Now once again we are saying that we want to just document everything, but here is where instead of saying any, I can add some filter saying that hey, provide documentation for only get handlers, not for post, or I can say /API/secured should not be included, etc., etc. I can do that, and then I can say build to finally build this. So there are a lot of documentation configuration you can do over here. Then let's see what is the error here. So we see some kind of a console log. Let's see what is that. It says here class not found docket. So this could be because when we actually added the Maven dependencies, it was still building. So we may have to stop this once. Let's clear the console and run the application once again and see if everything is okay. All right, looks like everything is fine. It's being scanning. You can see that scanning for API listing references. Tomcat has been started. Application has been started in 10 seconds. So I'm going to go back to the browser and first look for something like localhost 7777 slash, and then I type here v2 slash API docs. Now this is where you will be able to see some JSON documentation representing a lot of information. Let's copy this and open in Postman, and let's paste it, press enter. You can see that it's going to give me a JSON representing lots of API URLs. Now this is not very useful for us, but this is going to be used by Swagger UI. So how do I get into that? Very simple. You just have to say here swagger-ui.html, but when I press enter, you can see we get hello Spring Boot, and this is because we have mapped the slash to this particular hello Spring Boot. Now what I can do is I can just change this to slash hello, so that when slash hello is asked, this is the answer that we're going to get. If you're accessing the root of your service, then Swagger UI should give the response. So now if I explicitly access slash hello, we get this hello Spring Boot. But if I say here swagger ui.html, and now you should see that we got an API documentation over here. Now the API documentation includes application, which has a slash hello as one API. There's a basic error controller. Now we did not configure any error controllers, but if we do that, we will get, but there is a slash error with all get, head, post, etc. So this is not configured by us, but you can see customer REST controller. That's the name we gave in our application. So if I expand that, you have slash API customers, get all customers is the function or the handler for the same. There's a post for API customers. There's a get, put, and delete for this particular URL. If you select API customers, you can see that I'm able to supply some parameters. Also here, it says there's an underscore limit, underscore page as query string parameters. They're optional because there's a default value of 10 and 1 here respectively. These could be the possible responses. If it is 200, there's going to be okay, example values, and so on and so forth. Now, what you can do is you can also test the same thing by clicking on try it out. So let's do that. When I do that, it says these are the two values defaults. Do you want to execute? Let's execute and see. And it comes back and say, hey, this is how you do a C URL or curl. So on a Macintosh or Linux, I can just copy this and paste, and I should be able to get it on a terminal. But if you want to access from the browser, this is how it is going to be. And this is the response that we got, or we were supposed to get when we make a request. And of course, there's some options to download and so on and so forth. So this is how you use Swagger to create API documentation for all your microservices. Now that we have a production ready Spring Boot microservice application in hand, let's see how we can build a distributable jar file and run the jar file to achieve the same thing. So the first thing that we have to do is to go to our Eclipse and open the pom.xml. The pom.xml doesn't have dependency on H2 database because we added directly from project properties, and then we add it via Java build path library. So we don't need this in this way because the Maven tool for installing all the dependencies looks only here. So we don't want that to be missed out. We can get rid of the H2 dependency from here. So I can say remove and then add the H2 dependency over here. To get the H2 dependency, let's go back to the Spring initializer. Let's add here H2. Click on this. When I say explore the project, we will see the pom.xml, but this time I don't want to copy the entire pom.xml, but I just want to get the H2 database dependency. So I'm going to copy this, go back to Eclipse, in somewhere in between I'm going to paste this. The second thing is that because the H2 database is in the build path, Spring Boot automatically recognizes the H2 and then uses that as the driver. So we don't have to explicitly mention in our application.properties. So we don't need this. I can just make it as a comment, save it. And one last thing is to build the jar file by right click on the project, or the XML file, run as maven install, and this is going to create a distributable jar file reading all the dependencies from our pom.xml. And finally it said here build success, refresh target folder and say expand. You'll see that there is a Spring Boot demo 0.0.1 snapshot.jar. Now I can open up a command prompt or terminal and then run this jar file. Let's go to the terminal, create a new tab. Let's get into desktop, where I have this project called developing RESTful services using Spring Boot, and I have here a folder called workspace. That's where my project is there, which is called Spring Boot demo. Let's get into Spring Boot demo. And then I have here a target folder. So if you look at the target content, I have here Spring Boot demo snapshot.jar. So all I have to do is to type java -jar target slash Spring Boot demo so and so jar file. Now if I want to override any properties from the application.properties file, I can give that before the target location as -D server.port equals to, for example, 80 or anything of your choice. Now 80 is the default port for HTTP protocol, which means you don't have to mention the port number while issuing the command. Now if this is okay, we should be able to see our Spring Boot console logs. And somewhere in between it should also say HTTP server started at port number 80. Now once this is done, if I go back to the Postman and send this request again for 7777, we don't have this server running anymore, so it should not come back with an output. It says could not get any response, but either I can say here 80 or I can completely remove the port number, and this time I should get the output properly. Congratulations on completing this course. This course ends here, but learning continues. I hope you benefited from this course and enjoyed learning as much as I enjoyed creating this course. I sincerely thank you for purchasing this course and wish you success in your future. If you have any doubts or questions in any of my lectures or demonstrations, don't hesitate to get back. Your feedback helps me improvising my future courses. Once again, thank you and wish you all the best.